All right, so we had a couple guys asking about Areonose to Bullnose, and as you can see, I've dealt with quite a lot of Bullnoses. There's 3 just sitting here. We got an 87 sometimes here, and we had an 86 here, and I've had a couple 94s all the way through, so I'm going to give you guys the full in and full out, but this was an Areonose, and now it's been converted full-on Bullnose, so let's dive right into it. Welcome to Hi-Ho Stable Garage. Now, I don't got a tripod today, so you guys are going to have to forgive me. Just kind of filming this on the phone. But here we got a big block Ford, but that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the Bullnose conversion on a 90s pickup cab. So this right here, 90s pickup cab, Bullnose fenders. I think these are actually 82 fenders. And then it's running an 85 front fascia. But basically, your front firewall is going to be the exact same. You don't have to worry too much about that. You can run your 90s brake booster and master setup. Basically, just unplug your connector. Now you don't have ABS, but you know, these trucks never used to anyway. Your heater box, it can keep that going. Up here, this is your top cowl. Your top cowl, some of the bolt holes line up, some of them don't. See, this one right here doesn't line up with the original one, and there's actually a little gap. This is an 80s and 85 top cowl. Let me see if I can get you guys under here. You see that gap? It doesn't fit exact. If you use like an 87 to 91 cowl, it has the little tiny pinholes instead of these big slots where leaves can go in. That shouldn't be a problem. They fit a little bit better on the 90s cabs, but it's not noticeable from the outside. Same as your chrome, all that stuff. This stuff's all the same. Next up, suspension. You don't have to worry about anything suspension-wise. Suspension is going to be the exact same. Well, it's not the same setup. It's virtually the same setup, but for your conversion of this front clip and the rear box side, you don't have to worry about it at all. Hood mounts, hood latch, all that stuff. This stuff lines up perfectly with basically the hinges. These are actually 90s hinges that are on it right now with your front fenders and your hood. Now, this rad support might look a little bit different than your rad support. As for the Bullnose to Areonose conversion, as long as you have an 80s front rad support, you'll be fine. We got some creative stuff going on with the big block Ford and basically a 90s rad and all that stuff, but you can reuse your 90s rad. The hookups are generally the exact same. Even if they're not, though, you can move your hookups from your 90s rad onto your 80s rad down at the bottom. These slots right here, they're just bolted in. If you choose to use the 90s rad, it lets you get away from that copper lead rad, so you can basically upgrade your coolant capacity and everything. We're not going to touch on the big block Ford. Let's just keep rocking on this 80s front clip. So next up, your inner wheel wells. I don't have any on this truck. It's only a summer truck and basically only gets beat on pavement, so I elected not to use them. But you're going to need the 80s inner fender and your 80s battery tray. I'm actually using a diesel 80s battery tray. That's why it's over on this side here, because normally the battery's over there. But as long as you have an 80s tray, you can use that okay. You don't have to worry about it. But your 90s one won't work, so use your 80s one, you'll be all set. As for your rad support mounts, where they actually mount, again, this one, mileage may vary. That's kind of a custom one-off dealie just because of the rust, but that right there, same bolt hole on your 80s front clip of your 90s front clip, so you don't have to worry about that. Now, the biggest one for the 80s to 90s conversion, if you're using 80s or the 91, whatever, front cowl, hood, all that stuff, all that's going to pretty much bolt on except one spot. One spot I'm talking about is down here on this bottom clip piece. Here, the original one would mount from the side with a pin, just like that. Basically a bolt that mounts from the side. The 80s ones mount from the bottom. What you're gonna have to do is cut that off on the cab, just like that. Make a plate, put the plate on, and then drill your plate, and then put your speed nuts. Simple as pie. I just never got around to it. But basically, if you have a welder, you're going to be all set. Otherwise, you have to kind of make your bracket first, make an adapter bracket to go to that. Now, as for the interior, your seat, all that stuff's going to work with the 80s. Your doors are going to work with the 80s too. Normally the 90s doors come all the way down here and they got like a little pouch here and a couple other things. Well, you can take that panel off, and this is the 90s door with an 80s panel. Now, if you wanted to, you could change this whole door out, because see, it still has the 90s mirror on it. I actually like it better than those guys or the other ones there. But if you wanted to, you could change out to a bullnose door and put it on your 90s cab. This rocker panel will accept an 80s door, but an 80s cab won't accept a 90s door. Keep that in mind. Now, when it comes to your dash, there's a couple odd things that you have to do to make your dash fit, your 80s dash fit in your 90s cab. Dimensionally wise, they'll fit in snug as a bug. Your trim on your front A-pillars, it won't clear your dash pad. You're gonna have to trim that bad boy or run 80s. If you're gonna run 80s, this is all gonna be slightly different all the way through. This is 90s that I use. It was easier just to trim this here. Can't really see it anyway. Just put a nice little tapper in there, whatever you guys wanna do. As for the top of your dash pad, these bolt holes right there, right there, right there, and right there, they don't line up on the 90s cab at all. Your tabs are completely in a different sector, completely in a different area. So what I did on this is I basically welded tabs onto my 90s cab. So basically right where the normal tabs would be, I welded those off to the side, and then I could basically drill these and put my speed nuts in, bolt that guy right to it. The rest of it, as long as you have an 80s truck, you can move the brackets from the 80s truck and all that stuff and bring it over so you can attach the rest of this dash in. I know, if you're running the 90s heater box, you can't run the inner glove box bit, because there's your heater box right there on the 90s truck. I just basically rewired my 90s truck, and I got my little fan selector, and my heat's constantly on because we live in Canada, so it's just on constant hot. Otherwise, I just use my wing windows in the summer. But if you run the 90s box, you can't have a glove box. Kind of funny, eh? Now, this truck is also a manual transmission equipped truck. And the funny thing is, if you're running, in this case, I'm running an 80s clutch pedal assembly. Natively, you can't do this on this truck. So what I ended up doing, kind of take a look underneath, I modified the firewall to basically fit an 80s inside of the truck, because this basically bolts, you have 2 on the top and then 4 on the bottom that go in. You have to modify your truck, the cab, in order to fit the 80s clutch pedal assembly, because normally this right here on the 90s trucks comes out quite a lot more, and it's like an aluminum skinned piece that also includes your steering column. In order to run an 80s steering column in a 90s cab, you basically have to cut all this out, make it so then the 80s column will fit on 2 tabs. Basically, the premise is if you're gonna do inside work, you kind of need a welder. Weld tabs, weld brackets on, basically copy the 80s truck to go here, because they're not, some of the brackets aren't bolted on, they're actually welded on, seam welded or spot welded, so you kind of have to redo that. There's no getting around it. Now, as for your bed sides, again, we kind of never let this truck be. We kind of touched everything on this truck, so this is a long bed to short bed conversion. But a big one that you're gonna have to do on like the 87s and up trucks, they have a round wheel well. The 80s trucks, 81 or 80 to 86, they kind of have almost like a squared end on the bed side. So you're gonna have to get bed sides for your 90s box, because the bed side will be able to spot weld onto your 90s box. You don't have to change this interior bit here. But what you will have to do is change the wheel well, either with a patch panel, entire bed side, or, you know, just change the bed. That's what I elected to do. It was an 8-foot bed. We kind of cut it up now. So if you change the bed sides, you're gonna have to also change your lights down to 80s lights, because they're slightly different. I don't got a set of 90s lights sitting around here, and all the 90s trucks aren't on the property right now, but you're gonna have to change your tail lights. Also about the tail lights, the bulbs are different in these on the 80s trucks versus the 90s trucks. So you're gonna have to do some rewiring if you want to use your 90s harness. I just elected to use the 80s harness basically all the way through this truck. Simple stuff. But yeah, it's not hard to do an 80s conversion on a 90s pickup. This was originally a 90s 302 four-wheel drive long bed truck, and now it's a 80s truck, short bed, two-wheel drive, big block Ford manual. So the sky's the limit on these projects. You can basically do whatever you want. Time frame for just the bullnose conversion, so I'm just talking front end, not interior wise, just the front end and the bed, long bed to long bed, not the short bed conversion, any of that. Just the bullnose bits that make it look like a bullnose from the outside looking in. You can likely do that in 2 days. The front end takes the longest time, but if you're really, really good at what you do, unbolt the red, unbolt your connectors, take your bottom bolt out, take your middle bolt out. It's kind of like right there on the door on the inside. Take your two out on the top, and then take your two rad support bolts out if you can. You can take the whole front clip off, then vice versa, that guy back on. As for the bed, on this bed now, it's a short bed. You're only running 6 bolts, but if it's a long bed, you're running 8. Take all 8 bolts out, take it off, put the new bed on. That's the simplest process. 2 days, weekend, guys. You can get the whole thing done. I hope you guys enjoyed this video on the bullnose conversion on this truck. I've been meaning to do one. Never managed to get to it. There's a couple people asking about it. You'll see more of this truck likely next summer. We might do one more video on it, but we, you know, did the old drive shaft delete on her again by accident. You know, it really doesn't like the hop that happens in this rear end with that big block Ford. Really needs track bars or something, or, you know, different rear end suspension. Something to think about. Who really knows? I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one really, really soon. All right, see ya.